Hi class, it's Mrs. Fickus, and today we're going to continue with our drawing exercises on some foundation skills. We've talked about cubes, we've talked about spheres, we've talked about cones and cylinders, and we even looked at how to use those basic forms in a still life drawing and how to set one up with two objects. So now we're going to talk a little bit about perspective, because even if you were doing a still life, you might run into needing to use perspective a little bit. So let's say you had a square object like your cube, like some sort of box, or a stack of books, or a tabletop. You would kind of need to know how the perspective worked for that and how it related to other objects. And the easiest way to talk about perspective is in landscape, in cityscape, because it's very large scale and there can be a lot of things going on at one time. If you have a still life setup, you might only have perspective in a few objects, not in everything like you do in drawing a city. So we're going to talk about 1-point perspective and 2-point perspective, and you will need a ruler for this, because rulers, when you're doing perspective and structures like buildings, are super important. Unless you're one of those people who can draw line segments super straight, you're going to need a ruler. If you don't have a ruler, take a sheet of paper, fold it several times to make it kind of thick, and you can use it as a straight edge or the edge, the cardboard off of the back of a notebook, a spiral notebook. Anything that you have that has a nice straight edge, you can use. You don't necessarily need a ruler to measure. You can just need a straight edge. So let's get started. Okay, you can probably hear my washer and dryer going in the background, but oh well, as I've always said on these videos, when that happens, we got to do laundry, even in a pandemic. So this is a good example of 1-point perspective. Now there's a lot going on in this. Don't panic. You can do the same thing for like a scene with just a gravel road with a barn off the edge of the gravel road. The same principles apply. You have your vanishing point, which if you follow the tops of all these buildings, okay, you can see your vanishing point is way down here somewhere. If there was land up here, the vanishing point might be up a little bit higher, but we're looking way down here. So all the lines have to go towards that vanishing point, even the tops of the windows and the doors. And that's usually where people very quickly get themselves into trouble. They do the sides of the buildings in perspective, but then they forget that the tops of the windows and the doors have to slant that way too. See? See, we're right there like that. They all have to go that way. Okay? So then you have another type of 1-point perspective called worm's eye view. And that's what it would look like if you were down on the street looking up. That's the type of thing you would get. Your point for your 1-point perspective is here in the middle of the sky, and you'll notice that all the buildings, if I were to draw lines, all these would intersect at a point in the sky. You see this a lot in comic books, especially in the new Spider-Man movie, the animated Spider-Man movie. Into the Spider-Verse, they used a lot of those techniques in that. This is a worm's eye view with something from nature. So if you were on the ground looking up at a tree or even several trees, that would also be a worm's eye view. So if you were trying to draw this, you could have your vanishing point up here and then draw down from here like that. And then that would help you kind of array all of your branches out, almost like spokes on a wheel. Then you have bird's eye view. Bird's eye view is when you're looking down at buildings from above. You can't really see the bases of the building. You see where they touch the ground, but you can see the tops of the building. You only get this whenever your eye level is above the level of the building, the top of the building. So, you know, this is if you were standing on a building looking out, if you were inside a very tall building looking out, if you were in a plane or a helicopter, that kind of thing, then you would have this bird's eye view. Then you have 2-point perspective. 2-point perspective is whenever you're not looking at the building from one side, you can actually see two sides of the building. And so you start with the corner and you've got a vanishing point that's way over here somewhere, and you have another vanishing point that's way over here somewhere. So you have 2 points. That's why it's called 2-point perspective. This is also an example of 2-point perspective from a little bit further away. We're not as close to the building. And you can see the same thing applies to all these buildings. They're all moving over here towards one vanishing point, and then this side is moving towards the other vanishing point. We're not seeing the tops of our buildings because we're standing on the street and they're taller than we are. And so our viewpoint is lower. So we're going to get started. I've got my paper and I'll gather my stuff. Okay, we're just going to make up a city drawing. It'll be a lot easier to do that. If I try to find a reference picture, there's going to be too much going on for you guys and it might kind of confuse you a little bit. We're going to start out with 1-point perspective. So I've got my horizon line. I did not have to place it in the middle of my paper. I would not recommend placing it in the middle of your paper because we've all talked about the dead zone in the middle. But if I moved it a little bit too low or too high, I just didn't want you guys to have to deal with that. So I'm going to put our vanishing point in the center. And then I'm going to do our street. This would be just a basic, super basic drawing of a very simple street. Okay, so here's our street. I'm going to put a building right here. Now, I don't want to have it too close to my street because then that would actually have it right on the street. I want to be able to leave room for a sidewalk or a side street or something like that. So I'm going to start out with my building. And remember, it's very important, your vertical lines. It's very important that your vertical lines be vertical, that they be straight up and down. If they're not, then you're going to have a building that looks like it's about to topple over. So I'm going to have the side of my building here. I'm just kind of lining up my ruler by sight. I'm trying to be careful to make sure my lines are straight. Then I'm going to stop for a minute and I'm going to make sure that if I'm looking at the edge of my paper, is this line vertical and this line is vertical. Then I'm going to connect it to my vanishing point. You don't have to draw all the way to the point because I'm going to put some other buildings here and there'll be like a bazillion lines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure they're lined up, and we talked about this in the other video, and I'm only going to draw as far as I think my building needs to go. I'm still lined up. Then I'm going to move my ruler, line it back up with my vanishing point, line it up at the corner of my building. I'm going to do that. But I'm not just going to randomly connect these two because look, that wouldn't be straight up and down. That would not be vertical. I have to make sure it's vertical. I'm still going to have to erase some little line pieces, but not as much. So now I'm going to decide, I'm going to line my ruler up with my corner of my building, and I'm just going to scoot my ruler carefully across until I think that my building is wide enough. And I'm going to make sure that it's straight up and down. See how much would have been left and how different I would have had a line like this if I just connected my line segments, and automatically I would have a crooked building from the very beginning. That's one of the most common mistakes I see students make, is they take their line segments and they just connect them and they don't pay attention to whether or not that line is straight vertical. They completely just kind of ignore that. And a lot of times that happens about 3 steps in. So they've done the horizon line, they've done this, they've done the rectangle right here, and then somewhere that happens. A lot of times too, they'll do one building, and when they do the second building, it's like their brain has been erased and they've forgotten already that they're supposed to use that vanishing point. I'm going to create another building right here. I'm going to scoot it away from my first one, and I'm going to have it come out slightly farther, like this one's further back on the street. So I'm going to make it come down a little bit further. Oh, no, I can't do that. Hang on. I'm making it come out a little bit further. If I put it way down here, then that would mean it would be in front of this building, and I don't want that. So I'm going to put it right about there. This time I don't need to draw the whole rectangle. Watch and you'll see. Lining it up. Now you'll notice the closer you get to your vanishing point and the taller your buildings get, the steeper this line will get for the tops of your buildings. Okay, and now I'm just going to draw straight across from my bottom line, my bottom point. And I'm going to stop when I run into something. See, my ruler is straight, horizontal. Drawing with perspective is time consuming. I'm not going to lie. Now look, I don't want to just connect those, because look, I would have a wall that was going off this way when the other half of the wall is going this way. That's just not physically possible. Remember what we talked about whenever I showed you the cube, how you can't have one corner going one way and the other corner going the other? It's just not possible. Okay, so there we go. There's our two buildings on this side of our street. If I wanted to, I could come out right here from the corner of this one and the corner of this one, and I could make it look like there's a little side street or an alley that runs between the two buildings. There you go. Now I just erase anything I don't need. That's why you always want to draw lightly. Remember, I'm drawing a little bit darker than I normally would because you guys need to see it on camera. Very light pencil lines don't show up that well. And there's my two buildings. Now I've got to put doors and windows. Typically, this is where things go sideways pretty quick. So I'll get a student who will draw their door like that. Okay? Look at the direction the bottom of the door is going, and look at the direction the top of the door is going. They're part of the same door. They can't go in different directions. So what needs to happen is the top of your door is going to have to follow your vanishing point. Like that. Let me erase me a little bit. You also have to make sure that the posts on your door are straight up and down vertical. This is called the lentil. The top part of a door frame is called the lentil, and these are all called the posts. Now, a lot of times I will also have a student who for some reason will do that part. They'll use the vanishing point at the top and then they'll go like this. And for some reason, the sides of the door are leaning a different direction. They'll do that with windows too. They'll go like this, and then they'll go like this, and they'll end up with like windows and doors that are leaning in different directions from the building, from the side of the building that they're on. Which if they would really kind of stop and think about it, they would notice it. But pretty routinely they don't. Probably 50% of the time I'll have 50% of the kids who don't notice that. And some of it's just a maturity thing, an observational skill thing, and they just don't notice. Now remember, straight up and down vertical lines, so important. You can't let those tip. They gotta follow the same side as the building. If you wanted to create a lot of windows at one time, you can make stripes using your vanishing point. Space out. Notice how I'm still touching the vanishing point. Space out some lines on your building, still on my vanishing point, just kind of moving it like the hand on a clock. Keeping on my vanishing point. I'm trying to kind of make sure that I'm spacing them fairly equally. And you'll notice that as you get close to the horizon line, everything straightens out, and then once you dip below the horizon line, you start going downward. Okay, and I'm going to leave a spot right here for a door. And can't forget, I mean, how bad would it look if this was like this and those were like that? So very, very common mistakes that I see. And there's a little short door. Also, as you go back in space, everything's going to look smaller. Doors are going to get smaller, windows are going to get smaller, everything's going to get smaller. And then you could just go through and add some vertical lines to represent the glass on the window, like that. You just have to make sure that your vertical lines are always straight up and down vertical. And how you can tell is you can compare, that one's a little crooked, you can compare your ruler to the side of your paper. Okay. Perspective would also apply to any signs or street lamps or power lines. So if I wanted to have a street lamp right here, first of all, it's going to be really big because it's close to us. So it's going to be really big. And it's going to be really tall. And then maybe it comes out like this with a light on it. And there would be your street light. If you were to put a sign on it that would be for the street, then the sign would have to follow the perspective. If it was on this side, it would look like that, with straight up and down vertical lines. There's a street sign going that way. Then if you wanted to, you could put another one underneath it going the other way, and it would be just straight. Like that. Windows and doors on this side of these buildings, the side that's facing the viewer, would just be plain rectangles. This is 1 point perspective. You're not going to worry about a vanishing point for these. You would just have to make sure that your horizontal lines were straight horizontal and your vertical lines were straight vertical. Okay. And it would be the same if you had some ornamental trees or anything like that. If you had a bench right here on the side of the road, for example, let's say, here's my vanishing point, straight vertical, line it up, always lining up with that vanishing point. Here's the seat of my bench, and then the top of it would go like this, kind of like our signs. And then if you had wood on it, they would also slant towards your vanishing point. Once you get to drawing quite a bit, sometimes for little things like this, you can kind of see where you can vaguely draw in the direction of the vanishing point. See how they're still going towards the vanishing point? That just takes a lot of practice. So go ahead and continue with this if you have to. Find a simple image online to follow if you need that. You would follow the same rules on the other side of the street and just keep on going and try and make your city as crowded as possible. If you wanted to put another building back here, you would just follow the same things. You just wouldn't draw everything. Once you ran into another building, you would just kind of avoid drawing through it. And you will actually create a cityscape that is more believable if you have buildings behind other buildings. And just remember, the higher you go, as you get close to your vanishing point, the more extreme the slant is going to be at the top. And the less extreme the slant is going to be at the bottom. Like that. And there's a building way back there in the back. And you just keep on going. Perspective takes time and attention to detail. You go slowly and you make sure that you use a ruler the whole time. Okay, next we're going to do a 2-point perspective street. So we're going to end up having 2 vanishing points. This time I'm going to scoop my horizon line just a little bit lower than the middle. And I'm just lining my ruler up with the edge of my paper. It doesn't necessarily have to be a straight line because, you know, unless it's Kansas, You're not always going to encounter a super straight horizon. And we're going to put a vanishing point right here and right here. Now, as we looked at some of the pictures in my slides, you can tell that sometimes your vanishing points are going to be way out here on your table. For the sake of just teaching you how to do this, we're going to only use vanishing points that land on our paper. Hopefully you can see both of them. Okay, this time you're going to start with the corner of your building. So I'm going to put the corner of my building right here. So instead of doing a rectangle like I did before, I'm starting with a straight line. And we talked about that when we drew the cubes. I'm only going to go back. I'm lined up with my vanishing point over here. I'm only going to go back as far as I think that it needs to go. And let's say you had porches or railings or awnings or anything like that, overhangs, decks. They would still follow all these same rules. You would still use your vanishing point. Horizontal lines would be horizontal on some things, not everything. And vertical lines would be vertical. Most of your horizontal lines are not going to be horizontal, especially unless you are super, super close to your horizon line. Then you would have a horizontal line. Okay, I think, now see here, I got to have a nice straight vertical line, so I'm going to kind of gauge it by the edge of my paper. If you were using a T-square, which is a ruler with a T thing at the top, you can prop it up like this against the edge of your paper. You can prop it up against the other edge of your paper. But if you just take your time, you'll see it's not that hard. And then pick your paper up occasionally and look at it by holding it up whenever you're drawing on a flat surface like I'm doing, which it's so much easier to draw this way if you're doing perspective, because drawing on an easel is kind of difficult with perspective. If you are drawing flat, it kind of messes with you a little bit because you're always looking at your paper from a 45-degree angle. So you have to pick it up every so often and double check that what you're doing, like your lines are actually straight. Now, I'm going to put a door right here, and I know how high I want my door frame to be, how high I want my lintel to come up. So I'm going to do that first. Oh, it's right on the horizon line. And then I'm going to do the sides. We're still having to have vertical lines. Unless you were drawing like a rundown old warehouse or something like that, you are always going to have straight up and down vertical lines. They cannot slant at all. I'm going to make a larger opening right here, like it's some sort of garage door. Okay, ooh, that one was crooked. Let's see, because I could tell because the other one was not. This one was straight. So I needed to come in just a bit. There we go. I'm going to create kind of an overhang right here to go over my door. So I'm going to kind of have it'll look kind of like a parallelogram. Still using my vanishing points. Add a little bit of extra line if I didn't have enough. And there would be an overhang over my door. If I wanted to have a street running right here, the end of my ruler. Don't panic if you're using a bigger piece of paper and you have only a short ruler. Just draw as long as your ruler is, then line it back up on top of the line you drew and just keep on scooting and drawing smaller segments. You'll be okay. Now I'm making sure that they get wider at the bottom because that's what it does. Then I'm going to put another street right here. I'm keeping the edges of my street away from my building because I want to possibly include a sidewalk. We'll talk about sidewalks and fences. So here's my intersection. If I had a sidewalk in front of my building, my sidewalk would have to follow the same rules as my building pieces. But whenever I would start adding the seams from the concrete pieces of the sidewalk, I would have to use this vanishing point over here on this piece of sidewalk. So what I would do is I would go like this. And as I go up, notice I'm still planted on my vanishing point over here. It would look like this. Okay, and as I would go further and further and further, these lines would become closer and closer and closer together, like that. And there's my sidewalk. Okay, if I was drawing a sidewalk on the 1.1 that we did a little bit ago, you would still have like this. If this was a sidewalk right here, then these would run straight horizontal. Most of the time, I end up having kids that start tipping it like this, and then they start standing up. They're going to start standing up, and you'll go from sidewalk to fence. I have the same problem whenever kids do fences. They'll have their lines like this. I'd be like, okay, put the posts on your fence. Here's where the ground is. They'll start going like this, and they'll start out with a straight line and a straight line, and then gradually as they go, they start laying their fence down like that. They're posts, and they need to stay vertical. And you could have a few ones that slant or are crooked if you were trying to draw a country scene like a road with an old fence on the side, but then you wouldn't have all of them lay down and all of a sudden become a sidewalk. So for some reason, if they do a sidewalk, about halfway down, they start standing them up, and if they do a fence about halfway up, they start laying them down. And they don't even realize it until somebody points it out to them. So windows would follow the same rules as our doors. So if I knew I wanted a window right here, and I wanted the top here, and I wanted the bottom here, I would use my vanishing point, and then I would just make sure that my ruler was vertical and draw my window. Like that. Same thing if I was putting a sign here. Same thing if I added anything around here. If it's on this side, I use this vanishing point. If it's over here, I use this one. I could put another building right here, for example. I'll just freehand it. And I would still have to use this vanishing point and this vanishing point. Then drop my sides. And then here is another building right here. And then I could put a little sidewalk right there. So once you get going and you start understanding it, it's really not that hard. Most of the mistakes that people make are on the doors and windows. So good luck with your drawing in perspective. Keep practicing. If you would have cars or vehicles, they would also be in perspective. If I wanted to have a car right here, for example, start out with kind of a rectangle like this. I would start out like this. And then you would have another one right here. Oops. I don't know why my pencil did that. Of course, how could the pencil do it? It was in my hand. That's just me trying to blame it on my pencil. So here would be, for example, my car or my truck. So it would still have to follow these same rules of perspective. So I would have tire, tire. They would be kind of more ovals than they would be circles. And then I can start kind of messing around with like smoothing out any edges so it doesn't look so boxy. Bumper. You ever thought about how cars and trucks look like they have faces? There's a mirror. So you would just gradually round things off and pick at them until you ended up with something that looked like a car. But as you can see in my computer image here, see how you have the perspective lines on this car? Right here. Top of it's going that way. The bottom of it is going towards that vanishing point. Same thing with this car speeding by here. It's going that way at the bottom and this way at the top. It's still going towards my vanishing point. So everything would have to follow your vanishing points. The cars, the street lamps, the trees, tops of them are following. So just make sure you're aware of those relationships in your drawings. Good luck.